Thanks again, Alex. I'm here just for a brief minute to introduce Ellen as our speaker today, and also to alert Janine and Leonard, if you can, record this moment on, please. Thank you, and here's Ellen.
Good morning again. I thought I would be greeting you from my home on the shores of Keweenaw Bay, which is included in the boundaries of the L'Anse Indian Reservation, home of the Keweenaw Bay Indian community on the land of the Anishinaabe, ceded to the United States in the La Pointe Treaty of 1842. Here in Houghton, most of that is still true. This is the land of the Anishinaabe, ceded to the United States in the La Pointe Treaty of 1842. My plan was to give you a straightforward report on the doings at General Assembly. I want to tell you about the final report of the Commission on Institutional Change, the 2 actions of immediate witness, the business proposal, and also mention the periodic re-examination of Article 2, which is our statement of principles and sources. I will post links to relevant documents in the chat box before the end of the service. So if interested, you can look up and read the material that I'll be talking about for yourselves. But as I thought about the parts that I want to tell you about, I also wondered how we, KOOF, will respond. I thought about accountability in action in relationships, inspiration in truth and mystery, and restoration in acknowledgement and transformative, loving change. As you hear about the business of GA, I wonder how this will speak to you. My first GA was a Presbyterian General Assembly. I was a youth delegate from the First Presbyterian Church of Largo, Florida. Frankly, I don't remember much about the business and issues facing Presbyterians in those days. I do remember that I was loose in Cincinnati on my own, and I celebrated my 18th birthday by skipping the afternoon sessions and attending a professional baseball game with several other delegates. Oh, and also trying sake for the first time at dinner that night. But I'll tell you about the UUA's General Assembly. This year, held 100% virtually over 5 days in late June. Anyone who's attended any previous virtual GA events would recognize how things worked this year. As a virtual delegate new to GA, I did miss out on the person-to-person interactions and the baseball. Amlan, your other delegate, told me how much he missed the annual opportunity to connect with UU friends in person. I was impressed with the ease of the technology and the moderator's patience and care while glitches were addressed. That set a kind tone for the entire assembly. I was a better delegate this time, although I must confess to a case of professional development deficiency. I've been retired for a couple years now, and I do miss that surge of energy from learning with peers at a conference. I got a little giddy with UUA Kool-Aid, but it was the co-moderator's ministry and the urgency of the harm continually borne by Black, Indigenous, and people of color that grounded me for the challenging work ahead. I attended all the workshops I could. I think I only missed one session, but not for a ball game. There were so many that interested me. A significant number of those 90-minute workshops are now available on demand. If there's an interest, we could set up a workshop viewing Zoom meeting to share some of them. We can talk about that at the end. This year's GA title of Rooted, Inspired, and Ready was reflected throughout. Learning opportunities about UUA history, racism, and colonialism's generational impact, and the disparities that threaten democracy inspire us to action. Workshops about how to make change across all aspects of congregational life helped us get ready. The vibrant worship and many interactive workshops explored spiritual practices, giving theological ground for the necessary roots to sustain us. As your delegate, I attended all the general sessions and voted in each vote. The first vote I cast on your behalf was in support of the proposed business resolution embodying human rights in our investment decisions. The proposal described many of the human rights violations perpetrated on peoples around the world. The right to a secure future for all people is threatened by climate change and war. Our current systems that allow oppression are significantly affected by the activities of companies and corporations. So with the pursuit of social justice at the heart of our identity as UUs, as individuals and as an institution, we should not support or profit from corporations that are deeply complicit in human rights violations. We should use our relationships as consumers and investors to end corporate complicity with human rights abuses and environmental injustice. The proposal lays out a time frame for divestment, encourages shareholder activism, sets guidelines for socially responsible investing, and resolves several other actions to support the intention of the proposal. Some may recall Reverend Cindy Morris's work on this issue. The proposal passed with a strong majority. The Commission on Institutional Change presented their final report called Widening the Circle during a general session. The Commission was chartered in 2017 during another tense racial moment in response to requests for a truth and reconciliation process. Their work serves as the very beginning of that process. UUA leaders of color named problems within the UUA and our congregations. Problems about theology that UUs do not see addressing problems around race as a theological imperative. Problems about governance and hospitality because we had no structures or processes of accountability for the harming of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in our congregations. And that power is centered around white, cisgender, heterosexual, and temporarily able-bodied persons with means. And that too few white people are engaged in intentional anti-oppression work. Also, that the voices and experiences of marginalized people must be centered. Centering the voices and experiences of oppressed people changes the lens, giving attention to those who are most affected. The Commission was charged with conducting an audit of the power structures and analyzing systemic racism and white supremacy culture within UUA. They determined to articulate a liberating, anti-oppressive Unitarian Universalism, one in which the dysfunctional cultural expressions of our theology have been transformed. This report provides the background and trends in the following areas of our denominational life: theology, governance, hospitality and inclusion, living our values in the world, congregations and communities, religious professionals, education for liberation, restoration and reparations, innovation and risk-taking, accountability and resources. They use denominational data, words of denominational leaders, and the experiences of ministers, staff, congregates, and collaborators to illustrate the impacts of systemic racism within our denomination. Recognizing that engagement in this type of development is deep, spiritual, and faithful work that allows for growth and change, the Commission makes specific recommendations for change and work across all areas and levels of our UU lives and relationships. These changes are needed at the personal and interpersonal levels as well as ongoing and lasting change to systems of oppression. There has been some progress made so far, including new hiring practices, a response team to intervene in support of religious professionals of color, and that this GA centered the voices of Black, Indigenous, people of color, people who are gender expansive or living with disabilities. More white people are engaging in anti-oppression work with an even stronger sense of urgency. Creative new multi-generational and multicultural expressions of our faith can guide us, and more attention is focused on what living liberation theology means for UUs. However, the commission starkly concluded that what is at stake is nothing less than the future of our faith. Ignoring these issues, treating the report as just a nice document or pie in the sky, means accepting the status quo, and that is unsustainable in the world as it is, much less the world as we would have it. Many of our congregations are dwindling. Despite attracting people who find themselves in accord with our stated principles, often newcomers don't stay. Black, Indigenous, and people of color too often don't feel safe or at home in their own congregations. We UUs with social justice juice for blood are the whitest denomination. That ought to be a clue we're doing something wrong. The commission attributes significant attrition to our collective inability to address inclusion, equity, and diversity within our congregations. Our collective lack of social competence is out of step with younger generations' expectations and experiences. The report also called into question the equality of access to UUA decision-making and its impact on our democratic process. The report asserts that GA is not democratic because delegates are not true representative of congregations and are not accountable to them. GA is economically discriminatory if delegates are not subsidized. This led to recommendations for changes to the GA schedule and form and support for delegates from congregations. I've read about half of Widening the Circle so far. This is where I embrace some ideas to help me cope with the scope. The shifts are massive and tiny and personal. If I use both and, it helps. UUs are both people with a strong social justice identity and are members of an organization that has harmed its own people and has recognized the need for its own dramatic social justice transformation. This problem is both so huge that entire systems we've taken for granted must change, and we can start to affect change personally by reflecting, learning, and staying engaged and in relationship with one another. These changes can happen with accountability in action and relationships, inspiration in truth and mystery, and restoration in acknowledgement and transformative loving change. At KUUF, we have begun some critical steps already. We have a strategic planning process and plan. As we assess and update our plan, we can use the report to ensure all perspectives are heard and reflected in our goals and priorities. We have a covenant to express how we intend to be our best in relationship. Work is just beginning to update our conflict resolution process and safe congregation policy. The board will be considering how we work to renew our welcoming congregation certification. The report offers ideas about embedding anti-oppression in these documents and processes. We have begun to look at the 8th principle, which many congregations have already adopted. So KUF will receive a hard copy, or perhaps has already, of Widening the Circle, and it is available for purchase from Beacon Press. It's also available via the link that will be in the chat at the end. If you want to immerse yourself in the status and urgency of anti-racist work in our faith tradition, I recommend you spend a little time with this report. Your UUA is committed to this work, as the delegates' overwhelming support for the two following actions of immediate witness show. The action brought first, Amen to Uprising, a commitment and call to action, identifies the history, current condition, and searing impact of police violence on Black people, and the fact that faith communities have participated in creating our current society and systems. Our faith covenants to affirm the worth and dignity of every person and calls us to bring an end to all hells that exist and accountably transform ourselves. The action calls on the UUA to collaborate with organizations that are committed to the work of shaping a world with love and justice. Such a world would have alternatives to policing and creative processes for justice, rooted in the theology of liberation. This will also take the form of direct support for uprisings, with funds, space, and spiritual care for protesters. This will also include advocating for defunding the police, ending immigrant detention, and abolishing immigration and customs enforcement. The action commits us to creating authentic, multicultural, and anti-oppressive spaces. We need to acknowledge and repair mistakes and be resilient for the never-ending work of building our beloved community. The second action of immediate witness addressed 400 years of white supremacist colonialism, traces the history of damage to indigenous peoples since the landing of the Pilgrims, specifically naming the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, originally invaded by the Pilgrims and currently fighting the administration for their very reservation lands. This action calls us to stand with the Mashpee Wampanoag and all indigenous peoples, protecting their lands and waters, their peoples, their sacred sites, and their sovereignty. The action identifies the extractive and patriarchal system of white settler colonialism as resulting in unsustainable conditions for all living beings. UUs working on environmental justice issues are called to collaborate with and take leadership from the communities most impacted by extractive exploitation of resources. Now, this part I find exciting, not that the rest wasn't also. And I find it exciting and not just a mandated bureaucratic procedure, and that is the Article 2 review. Article 2 is our principles and sources, and the UUA bylaws mandate a periodic review. Completing this review is an action item in widening the circle under governance. The reviewers are called to use diversity, equity, and inclusion as their lens. I am excited about persons looking at our principles and sources through this lens. Despite our current statements about what we believe, we did not recognize how our systems were damaging people and relationships. How might we better express this to ensure our love for one another ensures equality? It's also exciting to me to think about our sources in an expanded way. And hearing some of the music being added to our Sunday services, to hear voices of others than those just in our hymnal is very exciting. Our UUA has called us all to go to work. This work is about restoring right relations. This work must happen by one person at a time, one conversation, one reflection, and one congregation by one fellowship, and in the meetings of the leaders of the UUA. Because we are asked to be differently with one another, and we need to reflect, to commit to positive conflict, to be uncomfortable, and to imagine. How can it be better for all? We might name direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, but if we don't hear the marginalized voices, we cannot make that a reality. I came away from many days sitting at my computer with an energized sense of direction and urgency. We are called to live into our values, to dismantle systems that do harm, and restore the relationships that will sustain us going forward. Your UUA is moving forward, and I am very curious how we will respond. Thank you. I think there is music from Alex next.